In the aftermath of COP26, governments around the world are looking to strengthen their climate policies. And there's a new report out from the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices about how Canada should take a whole of government approach to climate. I'm going to talk to Anna Kanduth about that report. So welcome to the interview, Anna.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, what is a whole of government approach to climate policy, and why should the government be taking that approach?
Yeah, for sure. So I think it's well known that, government departments largely work in silos. It's the nature of being a huge organization. But a whole of government approach is about breaking down those silos and getting government departments and agencies to work together in a more collaborative and coordinated way to tackle complex issues like climate change, and to also mainstream climate change considerations throughout government decision-making processes and policy-making processes. And you mentioned, lots of governments are upping their ambition on climate action, and the Canadian government's doing that as well. We've seen the new net zero commitment by 2050, increased ambition for 2030, and we're going to need a lot of ambitious policies to get to those goals. So we really do need an all hands on deck approach within the federal government. We also have seen that, climate change isn't just an environmental issue. It really touches a number of mandates of different government departments, from transport to infrastructure to health. So really getting more government departments engaged on climate issues is critical to have an ambitious approach.
You made a point in a blog post that this isn't new. Government's done this before. World War II would be an example.
Yeah, exactly. And we've also seen that a number of different jurisdictions have also implemented whole of government approaches. So both outside of the climate change issue, the World War II example is a good one, but also within climate change discussions. So the report that we released alongside IISD looked at some of those case studies in depth. So we looked at examples in British Columbia, the UK, and the US to understand, what a whole of government approach looks like there and what lessons we could learn for the Canadian context.
Now, you have 4 recommendations, and the first one is about sustained executive leadership. And this really starts at the top with the Prime Minister. And I suppose we could, in the Canadian context, because we have such a decentralized federation, it would be really nice if the Premier is bought in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the paper that we talked about was really focused on the federal government. So having executive leadership from the top down, from the Premier or Prime Minister's office, but of course having, an all of government approach across all orders of government is critical as well. So there's lots of governance structures and approaches that we could use to embed multiple orders of government in Canadian climate policy considerations.
One of the issues that came up when I was thinking about this, how this approach could be implemented, is there's a lot of call for a national electricity system, because in Canada, of course, we have 10 provinces, we have 10 electricity systems. They're all provincially run and regulated. They don't talk to each other very much and they work together even less. So the Liberals during the recent federal election campaign talked about a pan-Canadian grid council. And so they want to work with the provincial governments on breaking down some of those silos in this area. Is this one example we would call a whole of government approach?
Yeah, I think that's, a different example outside of, one order of government. So, this paper was focused largely on whole of government approaches within one order of government. So in this case, the federal government. But of course, I think, an all of government approach across multiple orders of government is another example of what you're speaking to, the Canadian Grid Council, of really embedding climate change considerations and bringing multiple orders of government together to work together on a common goal. And I think, as you mentioned, we're in a Canadian federation. Electricity is a great example of how we do have to have multiple governments coming together to share ideas and to collaborate to have a more efficient and effective transition to a zero emissions electricity system. And it's actually something that the Institute is working on right now. So we have a report coming out in the early spring that will be looking at how to align our electricity systems with a net zero future.
Well, it's interesting. I'll be looking forward to talking to you about that in the spring. The second recommendation is the whole government approach requires buy-in from people at all levels. Now, if there's anything we know about bureaucracies is they're tough to change. So how do we go about implementing this in the civil service?
Yeah, so I think it touches on that first piece that you were speaking to. I think having executive leadership from the top is really critical. So sending a clear signal to the whole of government, structure that this is an important issue and we want government departments and agencies to be working towards it. I think we also need to have sustained resources and mandates. So, giving government agencies and departments the resources to actually implement the whole of government structures and the clear mandates that this is a critical issue for the federal government would be important as well.
Yeah, that was the third recommendation, is sufficient resources, because I guess, the Canadian government is famous for making all sorts of promises and not putting in place, the policy, but B, the resources also to implement said policy. So something we Canadians have to work on.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what about the fourth one is transparency and accountability, which I guess in principle we can all agree is a good thing. But how do you make government transparent and accountable within a whole of government approach?
Yeah, so I think the BC example here is a good one. So the case study looked in particular at the Climate Action Secretariat that was created under Premier Gordon Campbell's leadership. And at the time, it was brought into the Premier's office. So it had a very public-facing persona. There was a public website. The public was able to kind of understand, what that body was doing and how it was helping the government implement its whole of government approach. Under successive governments, it kind of lost prominence and was shifted out of the Premier's office into the Environment Department, and its public website was taken down. So there's still kind of a bit of a mystery of what that body is doing. And I think that lack of transparency shows the role of having public facing information so that the public and other parts of government can understand how the government's implementing that whole of government approach.
So I guess BC's example of how to do it well, and then how not to do it well.
Yeah.
Anna, thank you very much for your insights. Always appreciate chatting with you.
Thanks very much.